Divorce doesn't arrive loudly. It slips in quietly, through unanswered questions, empty rooms, and nights that feel longer than they should. One signature can dismantle a life that took decades to build. A shared future becomes a past tense. And suddenly, a woman must face a terrifying question. Who am I without us? This is not a story about endings. This is a story about women who lost the life they knew and discovered the life they were meant to live. Chapter 1. Emily, Learning to Breathe Again. Emily spent 18 years being reliable, supportive, invisible in the way women often are when they put everyone else first. Her dreams were postponed, neatly wrapped in someday. Someday when things slow down. Someday when someone needs her less. When her marriage ended, the silence was deafening. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that echoes self-doubt. For months, she moved through life on autopilot. Then one evening, standing alone in her kitchen, she realized something startling. No one was coming to rescue her. And strangely, that felt empowering. She went back to school, changed careers, bought the red dress she'd once called too much. For the first time in years, Emily wasn't surviving. She was becoming. Chapter 2. Sophia, Turning Pain into Power. Sophia stayed longer than she should have because she feared loneliness more than unhappiness. When the marriage ended, loneliness arrived anyway. But so did clarity. She began running at dawn, not to escape her life, but to reclaim ownership of it. She wrote every night. Grief, anger, truth. With each page, she shed the woman who begged to be chosen, and stepped into the woman who chose herself. A year later, she launched her own business. 2 years later, she learned the freedom of saying no without apology. And one day, she realized something remarkable. Being alone was no longer her greatest fear. Losing herself was. Chapter 3. Claire, Choosing Herself at Last. Claire believed love required sacrifice, that endurance was a virtue, that a woman's need should come second. Divorce shattered that belief. She moved cities, let go of familiar faces, spoke out loud the thoughts she'd once swallowed. Claire stopped waiting for permission, to rest, to dream, to be happy. She didn't rebuild her old life. She designed a new one. Finale, when a woman begins again. These women are different. Different ages, fears, and scars. But they share one truth. Divorce did not break them. It revealed them. Sometimes life doesn't fall apart. It falls into place. If you are standing at the edge of an ending, remember this. You are not starting from nothing. You are starting from experience, resilience, and strength. And the most powerful love story you will ever live might be the one you write with yourself. The truth is, rebuilding a life after divorce doesn't happen in one brave decision or a single empowering moment. It happens in fragments, in quiet, uncelebrated hours, in mornings when getting out of bed feels like an achievement, and in evenings when the past tries to rewrite itself in your mind. Emily still had days when doubt crept in uninvited. Standing in her new office, surrounded by people who only knew her present, she sometimes wondered if they could sense the woman she used to be. The one who apologized too much, who shrank to keep the peace. But each time she spoke up at a meeting, each time she trusted her own voice, something inside her settled. Confidence, she learned, wasn't loud. It was steady. Sophia's success didn't erase her history. Some nights, the old fear returned, whispering that independence was just another kind of armor. Instead of running from it, she sat with the discomfort. She learned that strength didn't mean never needing anyone. It meant never abandoning herself again. Slowly, her life stopped revolving around proving anything. It began revolving around peace. Claire, in her new city, walked unfamiliar streets with a sense of cautious wonder. There were moments when anonymity felt lonely, when she missed being known. But there was also freedom in being undefined. She could introduce herself without carrying explanations. She could change her mind. She could start conversations that led nowhere and still feel complete. What none of them expected was how differently love would feel when it returned to their lives. Not as rescue, not as validation, but as a choice. A bonus, not a necessity. They no longer confused intensity with intimacy, or sacrifice with devotion. They recognized red flags not with fear, but with clarity. And perhaps the most surprising transformation was this. They stopped measuring their lives by what had been lost. The marriage, the years, the version of themselves that stayed too long. Instead, they measured their lives by what they were building now. Habits rooted in self-respect, boundaries drawn without guilt, dreams that no longer waited for permission. They understood something that can only be learned through breaking and rebuilding. A woman who has survived the collapse of her own life is no longer afraid of change. She knows she can endure uncertainty. She knows she can begin again. And in that knowledge, something powerful takes shape. That power did not announce itself dramatically. It unfolded slowly, like light entering a room through a window that had been shut for years. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A subtle shift in posture. A pause before agreeing to something that didn't feel right. A new relationship with silence. Not as something to be feared, but as a space where clarity lived. Emily began to notice how her body reacted to certain situations. Tight shoulders when she overextended herself. A calm steadiness when she honored her limits. For years, she had ignored these signals, dismissing them as inconvenience. Now she treated them as guidance. When she declined an invitation without explaining herself, it felt unnatural at first, almost rude. But afterward came relief. And then pride. Small, private victories that no one applauded. Yet each one reinforced a growing truth. She could be trusted with her own life. Sophia's world expanded in unexpected ways. Success brought visibility, and visibility brought opinions. Some admired her transformation, others questioned it. She learned quickly that not everyone celebrates a woman who no longer needs permission. At times, criticism stung more than she wanted to admit. But instead of shrinking, she asked herself a different question than she once would have. Is this aligned with who I am becoming? If the answer was no, she let the noise pass through her without settling. She also learned how grief could resurface without warning. A familiar song in a cafe. A passing couple laughing the way she once had. Healing, she realized, wasn't linear. It spiraled. But the spiral no longer pulled her downward. Each return to old pain came with new understanding. New compassion for the woman she had been when she didn't know any better. Claire found herself drawn to things she had once dismissed. Early mornings, long walks without headphones, conversations with strangers that lingered in her thoughts long after they ended. In anonymity, she discovered curiosity. Without an audience that expected consistency, she allowed herself to experiment with style, with opinions, with dreams that had never fit her old life. There were evenings when she cooked for one and felt an unexpected swell of gratitude. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was hers. The choices, the mistakes, the rhythm of her days. Ownership gave even the ordinary moments a certain weight, a meaning she had never experienced before. They all began to understand that rebuilding wasn't about erasing the past. It was about integrating it. The years of compromise had taught them discernment. The heartbreak had sharpened their intuition. What once felt like weakness revealed itself as endurance. They spoke differently now, too. Less explanation, more intention. When they shared their stories, they did so without bitterness, but also without minimizing the cost. They no longer softened the truth to make others comfortable. Their honesty wasn't aggressive, it was precise. New relationships, romantic or otherwise, were approached with patience. There was no rush to merge lives, no urgency to fill space. They observed how people handled boundaries, how they listened, how they reacted to independence. Attraction alone was no longer enough. Compatibility meant safety, respect, and room to grow. Sometimes, they caught glimpses of their former selves in other women. At work, at gatherings, in quiet confessions exchanged over coffee. Women who were tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Women who sensed something was wrong, but hadn't yet named it. They didn't offer advice unless asked. They understood now that awakening couldn't be forced. But they listened. And in listening, they reflected back possibility. There were setbacks. Days when confidence wavered. Moments when old patterns tried to resurface, dressed in familiar comfort. But now there was awareness. And awareness created space. Space to choose differently, even when the choice was uncomfortable. Gradually, their inner dialogue changed. The harshness softened. The constant self-interrogation gave way to curiosity. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" they asked, "What do I need right now?" It was a radical shift, one that altered how they moved through the world. They began to envision futures that weren't built around endurance, but around fulfillment. Futures flexible enough to evolve. Careers that reflected values, not just stability. Homes that felt like refuge, not obligation. Lives that could be redesigned again if necessary, because now they knew they could survive the process. What connected them was not resilience alone, but authorship. They were no longer characters reacting to circumstances written by someone else. They were shaping narratives in real time, aware that not every chapter would be graceful, but confident that it would be theirs. And still, questions remained. About love. About aging. About whether peace could coexist with ambition. They didn't rush to answer them. Uncertainty no longer felt like failure. It felt like an open door. In quiet moments, waiting at traffic lights, folding laundry, watching the sky change color, they sensed how far they had come. Not in distance, but in depth. There was more space inside them now. More room for complexity. More tolerance for ambiguity. Their lives were not defined by what ended, but by what continued to unfold. And as they moved forward, sometimes boldly, sometimes cautiously, they carried with them an unshakable knowing, one that didn't need to be spoken aloud, only lived, as the next choices began to take shape, and the story kept moving, unfinished, still becoming. That sense of becoming never fully settled into certainty, and perhaps that was the point. They learned to live without demanding resolution from life, without forcing clarity before it arrived. Some mornings began with confidence, others with hesitation, and neither felt like failure anymore. Both were simply part of motion. Emily noticed how her relationship with time had changed. She no longer rushed through days, as if trying to escape them. Weekends weren't something to recover from or prepare for. They were something to inhabit. She started taking photographs, not for social media, not for anyone else, but for herself. Shadows on walls. Coffee cooling by a window. Proof that she was present. Proof that her life no longer existed only in service of outcomes. At work, she stopped volunteering for exhaustion. When she was overlooked, she spoke. When her ideas were taken seriously, she accepted the recognition without deflecting it. There was discomfort in this visibility, but it was clean discomfort, the kind that accompanies growth rather than erasure. She was no longer trying to be indispensable. She was allowing herself to be respected. Sophia found that success brought an unexpected challenge, stillness. When survival was no longer the driving force, she had to confront who she was without urgency. There were moments when she felt restless, unsure what to chase next. Instead of filling the space, she let it stretch. She discovered that purpose didn't always announce itself as ambition. Sometimes it arrived as alignment, as knowing when to stop. She began mentoring younger women, not with rehearsed wisdom, but with honesty. She spoke about the cost of silence, about how fear could disguise itself as loyalty, about the relief that comes when you finally tell the truth, even if your voice shakes. Watching others recognize themselves in her story didn't inflate her ego. It grounded her. It reminded her why she had chosen herself in the first place. Claire's world continued to expand inwardly. She started writing again, something she had abandoned years ago because it felt impractical. She wrote without plans to publish, without expectations, just pages filled with fragments, memories, questions, observations. Writing became a conversation with herself, one she had postponed for decades. Through it, she noticed patterns she had never named before, the way she avoided conflict by disappearing, the way she mistook adaptability for generosity. With this awareness came gentler choices. She stopped over-explaining. She allowed pauses in conversations without rushing to fill them. She let people misunderstand her without immediately correcting the narrative. Not everyone needed access to her inner world. Privacy, she learned, was a form of self-respect. Across their lives, something subtle but profound was happening. They were redefining success. It was no longer measured by permanence, by how long something lasted, or how well it appeared from the outside. Success was waking up without dread. It was alignment between values and actions. It was the ability to leave a situation that diminished them, even if leaving meant stepping into the unknown. They also learned how deeply the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Certain tones of voice still triggered unease. Certain dynamics made them alert in ways they couldn't always explain. Instead of dismissing these reactions, they honored them. Intuition was no longer mystical, it was practical. It had been trained by experience. Friendships shifted. Some grew closer, nourished by honesty and mutual respect. Others faded, unable to adapt to women who no longer centered themselves around availability. There was grief in this, but also clarity. They understood now that not all connections were meant to survive transformation. There were nights when loneliness resurfaced, not as desperation, but as a quiet ache. A longing not necessarily for partnership, but for witness. For someone to see the full arc of who they were becoming. Instead of rushing to fill that longing, they allowed it to exist. They trusted that connection, when it came, would meet them where they stood, not where they once were. They became more intentional with their energy. What they read, what they watched, who they allowed to influence their thinking. They were no longer willing to consume narratives that romanticized suffering or glorified self-abandonment. They sought stories that reflected complexity, growth, contradiction. Occasionally, they looked back, not with regret, but with curiosity. They could trace the moments where they ignored themselves, where love became labor, where hope turned into endurance. And instead of judgment, there was compassion. They had done the best they could with the awareness they had at the time. This compassion extended outward. They became less reactive, more discerning, less eager to fix, more willing to listen. They understood that everyone was navigating invisible battles, that certainty was often a performance. This didn't make them passive. It made them precise. As seasons changed, so did their sense of identity. They were no longer defined by marital status, by roles inherited rather than chosen. Identity became fluid, responsive, something they could revise without shame. They were not afraid of becoming someone unrecognizable to their past, because they had learned that familiarity was not the same as truth. And still, the future remained open, not as a threat, but as an invitation. They didn't need to map every step to trust the direction. They moved forward with curiosity, carrying both wisdom and vulnerability, knowing that rebuilding was not a phase they would outgrow, but a skill they would continue to use, again and again, as life unfolded and new chapters began to form, shaped not by fear of loss, but by a growing confidence in their ability to respond to whatever came next, even when the shape of it was not yet clear, even when the questions remained unanswered, even when the story continued to write itself in ways they could not yet fully see, only feel, as the momentum carried them forward into moments still arriving, still incomplete, still open. That openness began to influence the smallest decisions. What they wore in the morning, how they arranged their homes, which invitations they accepted, and which they declined without apology. There was intention now, even in choices that once felt automatic. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet alignment between inner truth and outward action. Emily found herself less interested in proving competence, and more interested in cultivating satisfaction. She no longer equated exhaustion with worth. When a project ended, she took time before rushing into the next one, allowing space to notice what actually energized her. In that pause, ideas surfaced, creative, unconventional ideas she once would have dismissed as unrealistic. Now she let them breathe. She also became more attentive to joy, not the grand, celebratory kind, but the subtle moments that passed unnoticed when life was hurried. The warmth of sunlight on her face during lunch breaks, the comfort of music playing softly while she cooked. These moments didn't demand anything from her. They simply existed, and she learned to receive them without guilt. Sophia's relationship with control continued to evolve. She had once believed that planning every detail would protect her from disappointment. Now she experimented with trust in timing, in people, in herself. She allowed projects to unfold organically, resisted the urge to intervene too soon. Sometimes things failed. Sometimes they surprised her. Either way, she remained intact. She noticed how differently she handled conflict. Where she once avoided it or fought to be understood, she now listened first, not to concede, but to assess. Not every disagreement required resolution. Some revealed incompatibility, and that was information, not a challenge. Walking away no longer felt like loss. It felt like clarity. Claire's writing began to change tone. The early pages had been heavy with excavation, with trying to understand what went wrong. Gradually, her words shifted toward observation. She wrote about people she encountered, about fleeting interactions that left an impression. She wrote about the courage it took to live, without a script. Through language, she traced the contours of her evolving self, noticing how much space there was now between impulse and response. She also allowed herself pleasure, without justification. An afternoon spent wandering bookstores. A spontaneous trip taken alone. Rest, chosen deliberately rather than earned through productivity. Each act dismantled an old belief that life was only valuable when it was useful to others. Across their separate lives, they began to embody a new kind of confidence. Not performative, not defensive. A grounded assurance that didn't require validation. They were comfortable saying, "I don't know," and equally comfortable saying, "This doesn't work for me." Their boundaries were not walls. They were thresholds, clearly marked. People responded differently to this shift. Some leaned in, drawn to the authenticity. Others recoiled, unsettled by women who no longer explained themselves into palatability. The reactions were revealing. Instead of internalizing them, the women observed, learned, adjusted. They also discovered how often society rushed women to move on, to repartner, to restore a familiar narrative. They resisted that urgency. Healing wasn't something to be completed on a schedule. Growth didn't require witnesses. They trusted the pace that felt true, even when it didn't align with expectations. There were moments of longing, for shared laughter at the end of the day, for companionship that didn't require translation. They didn't deny this desire. They honored it, without letting it override discernment. Wanting connection didn't mean settling for it. They had learned the cost of that equation. When love appeared again, sometimes tentatively, sometimes unexpectedly, they met it with presence rather than projection. They asked different questions now. How do I feel around this person? Do I feel expanded or diminished? Is my nervous system calm or alert? Love was no longer an escape. It was a conversation. They paid attention to how they recovered from disappointment. A canceled plan no longer felt like rejection. A misunderstanding didn't spiral into self-doubt. Resilience had become reflexive, not because they were hardened, but because they trusted their capacity to adapt. Memory softened its edges. The past no longer interrupted the present without warning. It visited occasionally, like an old photograph pulled from a drawer. They could look without being pulled back in. They could acknowledge what had been lost without longing to return. They noticed how often other women sought them out, not for answers, but for permission. Permission to question, to pause, to choose differently. They didn't position themselves as examples. They simply lived visibly, honestly, allowing others to draw their own conclusions. In moments of solitude, they reflected on how profoundly their definitions of strength had changed. Strength was no longer endurance without complaint. It was discernment. It was rest. It was the courage to disappoint others rather than betray oneself. They understood now that rebuilding was not about replacing what was broken with something similar, but about constructing something truer, something responsive, something capable of evolving. The foundation was no longer fear of loss, but trust in their own resilience. As days continued to unfold, some ordinary, some quietly transformative, they moved with an awareness that life would continue to ask things of them. Change would return in new forms. Uncertainty would reappear. But there was no longer panic in that knowledge. They had learned how to listen inwardly, how to pause before reacting, how to remain present even when answers were delayed. This skill, once foreign, now felt essential, woven into how they navigated every relationship, every decision, every unknown. And as they kept moving, sometimes slowly, sometimes with sudden momentum, their lives remained open systems, responsive and unfinished, shaped not by a need for certainty, but by a growing comfort with becoming, with allowing the next moment to reveal itself, and the next choice to emerge, and the story to continue unfolding in ways that could not yet be named, only lived. As time carried them forward into experiences still forming, still unresolved, still in motion, that motion began to feel familiar, almost welcome. They no longer braced themselves for the next shift in the way they once had. Instead, they met it with a quiet readiness, an understanding that stability did not mean stillness. It meant adaptability without self-erasure. Emily noticed how differently she spoke to herself when things went wrong. A missed opportunity no longer triggered a spiral of self-blame. She assessed, adjusted, moved on. There was efficiency in her compassion now. She didn't linger in punishment. Mistakes became information, not indictments. This alone changed how she showed up in every area of her life. She also became more comfortable being seen in transition. She used to hide uncertainty, believing it diminished her authority. Now she allowed others to witness her learning, her refining. Paradoxically, this transparency made people trust her more. She no longer performed certainty. She embodied credibility. Sophia's days grew quieter, though no less meaningful. She reduced the noise that once surrounded her success. Fewer meetings, fewer explanations, more depth. She spent time evaluating not just what she was building, but why. Legacy became less about impact and more about integrity. She asked herself whether her life felt sustainable from the inside. She noticed how often women apologized for taking up space, even in rooms that needed them. She interrupted those apologies gently, modeling another way. Not correcting, not instructing, just existing unapologetically. It was subtle, but powerful. Presence, she realized, was contagious. Claire began to recognize how much energy she had once spent anticipating disappointment. Now, when something good happened, she let it land. She resisted the instinct to scan for the cost. Joy no longer required vigilance. She allowed moments to be purely what they were, without preparing for their end. She also noticed how her body responded to honesty. Speaking plainly felt grounding. Avoidance, on the other hand, left a residue she could no longer ignore. This awareness guided her decisions more than logic ever had. She trusted the sensations that arose when something was misaligned, even if she couldn't yet articulate why. Across their lives, a new relationship with patience emerged. They were no longer rushing toward outcomes. They were cultivating processes. Growth became something to tend, not something to achieve. This shifted how they evaluated progress. Small, consistent changes mattered more than dramatic breakthroughs. They learned to sit with unanswered questions without turning them into emergencies. What comes next? Who will I become? Will this choice matter in 5 years? These questions no longer demanded immediate resolution. They could coexist with contentment. Ambiguity lost its threat. They also learned to recognize when they were outgrowing environments. Rooms that once felt expansive began to feel restrictive. Conversations that once energized them became repetitive. Leaving no longer required justification. Growth itself was reason enough. Sometimes they surprised themselves, saying no when the old version would have said yes, leaving early, asking for what they needed without rehearsing. Each surprise reinforced trust. They were learning their own patterns anew. There were moments when they felt grief for the women they might have been if circumstances had been different. Not regret, exactly. More like a tender acknowledgement of alternate paths. They held these thoughts gently, without longing to return. The present felt earned. They also recognized how their stories intersected with larger narratives about gender, expectation, endurance. They became more critical of myths they once accepted without question. The idea that love should hurt, that sacrifice was noble, that starting over meant failure. These beliefs no longer fit. Instead, they replaced them with quieter truths. That peace was productive. That boundaries created intimacy, not distance. That choosing oneself was not selfish, but foundational. In relationships, they listened for consistency rather than promises. They paid attention to how people handled discomfort, disagreement, silence. They valued repair over perfection. When something ended, it no longer felt like proof of inadequacy. It felt like completion. They became adept at noticing when they were slipping into old roles. The caretaker, the mediator, the one who absorbed tension to keep things smooth. Awareness gave them choice. They could step back without guilt, trusting that not every imbalance was theirs to correct. There were mornings when they woke with a sense of anticipation, not for a specific event, but for the unfolding itself. Life no longer felt like something happening to them. It felt participatory, responsive. They understood now that rebuilding was not linear and never final. It was a way of engaging with life, an ongoing practice of alignment, adjustment, and recommitment to self-trust. As time passed, the sharp edges of their past softened further, not because the memories disappeared, but because they no longer defined the terrain. New experiences layered over old ones, creating depth instead of division. They moved through their days with a steadier rhythm, not rushed, not stalled, attuned. They noticed when something felt off and responded early, before resentment accumulated. This attentiveness saved them from many quiet losses they once would have endured in silence. And as they continued forward, choosing, revising, listening, their lives remained in motion, shaped by awareness rather than fear, by intention rather than habit, unfolding moment by moment, without a fixed destination, without a final version, only the ongoing act of becoming, as the story continued to stretch ahead of them, open and unfinished, waiting for the next choice to take form. That openness became something they carried effortlessly, like a second language learned through immersion. Rather than study, they didn't announce their growth or mark it with milestones. It revealed itself in how they moved through rooms, how they listened without urgency, how they left conversations that no longer resonated without carrying the weight of explanation. Emily noticed that her tolerance for chaos had changed. What once overwhelmed her now felt manageable, not because life had become simpler, but because she had become more anchored. When plans shifted or expectations dissolved, she adjusted without losing herself. Flexibility no longer felt like surrender. It felt like skill. She also became more selective with her attention. News cycles, opinions, the constant hum of urgency. She learned when to engage and when to step back. Protecting her focus wasn't avoidance, it was stewardship. Her energy, once scattered, now felt directed, intentional. Sophia experienced a similar refinement. She became attuned to subtle misalignments before they grew loud. A project that drained her. A collaboration that required too much justification. She no longer waited for burnout to confirm what her body already knew. She trusted the early signals and acted accordingly. There was a lightness in this discernment. Decisions didn't have to be dramatic to be decisive. Walking away could be quiet. Choosing differently could be calm. Strength didn't need an audience. Claire began to see how deeply she had internalized the idea that life should be explained. She practiced letting experiences stand on their own. Not every insight needed to be shared. Not every feeling needed to be processed publicly. Some things could remain hers, unpolished and true. She found comfort in routine, not as rigidity, but as rhythm. Morning rituals, familiar cafes, evenings spent reading instead of scrolling. These patterns grounded her, giving shape to days that no longer revolved around someone else's needs. Across their lives, they noticed how their emotional landscapes had expanded. They could hold joy and sadness simultaneously without rushing to resolve the tension. Happiness no longer felt fragile, as if it might shatter under scrutiny. It was spacious enough to coexist with uncertainty. They became curious rather than defensive when confronted with disagreement. Not every challenge was a threat. Some were invitations to refine their thinking. Others clarified values. They learned the difference, and that discernment saved them from unnecessary battles. They also grew more aware of how often women were taught to smooth discomfort for themselves and others. They stopped doing that work automatically. Allowing awkwardness to exist felt radical at first, then liberating. Silence became a tool rather than a void. There were moments when fatigue set in, not physical, but existential. The quiet weight of responsibility that comes with self-authorship. No one else to blame. No script to follow. On those days, they rested instead of pushing through. Rest became an act of maintenance, not indulgence. They began to see how resilience was built not in grand recoveries, but in daily recalibrations. Choosing honesty over harmony. Choosing rest over performance. Choosing curiosity over certainty. These choices accumulated, slowly reshaping their lives. Memory continued to evolve. Old narratives lost their grip. What once felt like betrayal now felt like information. What once felt like failure now felt like transition. The meaning changed, and with it, the emotional charge. They noticed how differently they approached fear. Instead of asking how to eliminate it, they asked what it was protecting. Fear often pointed to something valuable. A boundary, a desire, a truth not yet spoken. Listening to it didn't mean obeying it, but it meant acknowledging its presence. In moments of connection, they felt more available, less guarded. Because boundaries were clear, openness felt safer. Vulnerability no longer meant exposure without protection. It meant selective transparency, offered where it was likely to be met with care. They also learned to celebrate themselves quietly, not with declarations, but with recognition, acknowledging progress internally, without waiting for external validation. Pride no longer felt boastful. It felt grounded. Sometimes, they caught themselves smiling at the ordinariness of their lives, the absence of drama, the predictability of peace. What once might have felt boring now felt rich. Stability, they discovered, was not the enemy of growth. It was its foundation. They became attentive to how they entered spaces, whether they arrived braced or open, defensive or curious. This awareness allowed them to reset, to choose presence over projection. First impressions mattered less than internal alignment. They also noticed how time seemed to stretch. Days felt fuller, not because more happened, but because they were more present for what did. They no longer rushed through experiences in anticipation of the next one. This patience gave life texture. There were still unanswered questions about love, about legacy, about what it meant to age well, to remain open without becoming naive. These questions didn't weigh them down. They accompanied them, like companions rather than burdens. They understood now that rebuilding a life was not about reaching a finished version of self. It was about cultivating responsiveness, the ability to meet each moment without abandoning oneself, to remain flexible without losing integrity. As they continued forward, their lives unfolded in layers, some visible, some private, shaped by countless small decisions made with awareness rather than habit. The path ahead remained undefined, not because it was unclear, but because it was alive, adjusting with each step, each pause, each moment of recognition, as the movement continued, unhurried and open, carrying them into experiences still forming, still evolving, still inviting the next choice to emerge, and eventually, something remarkable became clear. Not all at once, not with fireworks or declarations, but with a quiet certainty that settled deep within them. The life they were living now was not a consolation prize. It was not a reduced version of what they once imagined. It was fuller, truer, and unmistakably their own. They understood that divorce had not taken something from them. It had returned something they had misplaced along the way. Their voice, their instincts, their sense of authorship. What once felt like collapse revealed itself as release. The ending they feared had become the opening they needed. They no longer measured themselves by endurance. They no longer romanticized suffering or confused loyalty with self-betrayal. They knew now that love was not meant to erase a woman, and commitment was not meant to require her disappearance. Any life, any relationship, any dream that demanded silence as its price was no longer negotiable. What replaced that old mindset was something steadier than confidence. It was self-trust. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't perform, doesn't seek permission. The kind that says, quietly and firmly, I will not abandon myself again. They had learned that rebuilding a life is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering who you were before you learned to shrink, before you learned to wait, before you learned to trade truth for harmony. And remembering, they discovered, is an act of courage. Their days were not perfect. They were real. There were still moments of doubt, still moments of longing, still moments when the past flickered at the edges of the present. But those moments no longer defined them. They passed through without taking residence. The women had learned how to hold memory without living inside it. And perhaps the most powerful transformation was this. They stopped seeing their lives as stories that had gone wrong. They saw them as stories that had evolved. Chapters had closed not because they failed, but because they had grown beyond what those chapters could contain. They walked forward now, with a different posture. Shoulders relaxed. Eyes open. No longer scanning the horizon for rescue or validation. They knew that whatever came next, love, solitude, success, uncertainty, they would meet it intact. Their presence changed rooms. Not because they demanded attention, but because they were no longer seeking approval. There is something unmistakable about a woman who knows she will be fine no matter what. Something grounding. Something magnetic. They became living proof of a quiet truth. The world rarely tells women loudly enough. Starting over is not a setback. It is a skill. And once you learn it, fear loses its power. They no longer rushed to fill space. They understood that a full life is not one crowded with people or noise, but one aligned with meaning. Peace became their measure, integrity their compass. And when they spoke about their past, they did so without bitterness and without nostalgia. They spoke with clarity, with ownership, with gratitude for the lessons that reshaped them, even when those lessons came wrapped in loss. They knew now that happiness was not something waiting on the other side of perfection, partnership, or permanence. It was something built daily, through choice, through honesty, through the willingness to listen inwardly even when the truth was inconvenient. Their lives did not look the way they once planned. They looked better, because they were lived consciously. And if you are listening to this story and find yourself standing in the aftermath of an ending, unsure of who you are, without what you lost, know this. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not late. You are standing at the most honest starting point there is. A life rebuilt after divorce is not smaller. It is stripped of illusion. It is spacious where it matters. It is strong in places that cannot be taken away. These women did not rebuild their lives to prove anything. They rebuilt them because they chose themselves. And that choice, quiet, radical, unwavering, changed everything. Their stories do not end here. They continue, unfolding in ordinary days filled with presence, courage, and self-respect. Not perfect, not finished, but deeply, unmistakably alive. And that is the kind of ending that is really a beginning.